At 3:15 a.m. June 22, 1941, the night sky over Eastern Europe split apart. 1,000 German guns roared as one, their shells streaking east into the sleeping Soviet frontier. Villages erupted in fireballs before their inhabitants could even rise from bed. Above, the drone of engines swelled, squadrons of Luftwaffe bombers racing ahead of dawn, hammering airfields where Soviet planes sat lined up like sacrificial offerings. On the ground, steel beasts surged forward, panzer divisions, headlights blacked out, grinding across the Bug River bridges they had seized in the dark. Behind them rolled an army of 3 million, the largest invasion force in human history. In Moscow, telephones rang unanswered in the small hours. Stalin, shaken from uneasy sleep, refused to believe what was already burning into reality. For nearly 2 years, he and Hitler had played at peace. Now, without warning, the pact was dead, torn apart in a single morning. The gamble was colossal, Hitler's vision of a swift annihilating strike that would crush the Soviet Union in weeks. Yet, beneath the euphoria of the first explosions lay a truth no one in Berlin could yet see, that this day, this hour, would mark the beginning of Nazi Germany's destruction. The summer of 1941 was the high water mark of Hitler's war in Europe. France had fallen in 6 weeks, the British clung desperately to their island, and the Balkans lay in ruins after German blitzes. The Nazi war machine seemed unstoppable, and to many in Berlin, the Soviet Union looked like the next easy domino. But beneath this confidence lay an older, darker obsession. Since the 1920s, Adolf Hitler had raged against Bolshevism, equating it with a Jewish conspiracy. In Mein Kampf, he wrote of Lebensraum, living space, in the East, imagining fertile Soviet lands feeding a German empire for centuries. To him, the USSR was not merely a rival, power. It was an ideological cancer to be burned out entirely. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939 had been a cynical truce. Publicly, it split Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Secretly, it bought Hitler time to conquer westward without a second front. To Stalin, the pact promised breathing space to rebuild an army gutted by purges. Both leaders mistrusted each other. Both plotted for the day the other would break it. By late 1940, Hitler was convinced that Britain held out only in hope of a Soviet ally. Destroy the USSR, he believed, and Britain would sue for peace. His generals warned of the distances, the climate, the sheer size of the Red Army. But victories in Norway, the Low Countries, and France had bred a dangerous arrogance in the Führer's mind. He had ignored them before, and triumphed. The stakes were staggering. If the gamble succeeded, Germany would control the oil of the Caucasus, the grain of Ukraine, and the industrial heartlands of the Soviet West, resources to fuel a 1,000-year Reich. If it failed, Germany would face a war it could not sustain. By the spring of 1941, the dice were already rolling toward the most colossal land battle in human history, and when those guns opened fire on June 22nd, the spark lit a front that would consume more lives than any other in the Second World War. The first light over the Bug River was pale and cold. Mist curled off the water, drifting through the reeds along the Soviet bank. Private Mikhail Belyaev, a 19-year-old border guard, stood his watch in the quiet hour before sunrise. His post was little more than a wooden hut with a field telephone and a battered rifle. For days, rumors had whispered of German troop movements on the far bank. But here, the world still seemed frozen in the fragile peace of the past 2 years. Across the river, the fields of occupied Poland lay shrouded in darkness. Then, faintly at first, came a sound that made Belyaev's breath catch, a low, rising thunder. It wasn't the wind, nor the distant rumble of carts. It was mechanical, rhythmic, growing louder with every heartbeat. Before he could lift the field phone, the horizon exploded in flame. A wall of fire swept across the far shore, German artillery unleashing its first deadly barrage. Trees shattered, soil geysered into the air, and the shockwave knocked Belyaev to the ground. Above, the black sky lit with streaking aircraft, their engines howling as bombs fell on the nearest Soviet barracks. Through the smoke, he glimpsed dark shapes, tanks, hundreds of them, pouring across pontoon bridges that had appeared as if conjured from the mist. The war had come in an instant, a storm without warning. By nightfall, this river outpost would no longer exist. But as German forces surged east, they had no idea that many of these quiet river towns would soon become names burned into maps of blood and ruin. In the heavily guarded Wolfslair headquarters in East Prussia, the night before the invasion was thick with cigarette smoke and nervous anticipation. Maps covered the walls, vast swaths of the Soviet Union, marked with bold arrows thrusting toward Leningrad, Moscow, and Kiev. Around the long oak table, field marshals and generals stood stiffly, awaiting the man whose decision had already set history in motion. At precisely 1:30 a.m. on June 26, Adolf Hitler entered. His face was pale, his eyes restless, but his voice carried the certainty of a man convinced of destiny. "The time has come," he declared. "The Soviet colossus will be struck down before it can awaken." This was the culmination of months of preparation under the codename Operation Barbarossa. Over 3 million German and Axis soldiers had been moved into position in secrecy. Hitler's belief was absolute. The Red Army would collapse in 10 weeks, perhaps sooner. In private, he dismissed his generals' warnings about the distances, the roads, and the brutal Russian winter. "We have only to kick in the door," he had told them, "and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." Orders rippled outward. Encoded signals flashed to frontline units. Artillery crews received their firing coordinates. Luftwaffe pilots readied for pre-dawn takeoff. The invasion timetable was so precise that some commanders joked a man could set his watch by the first shots. When Hitler finally gave the official go order, the machinery of the largest land invasion in history lurched forward. Staff officers in Berlin watched the clock, knowing that at the exact moment the guns fired, the Reich would be committed to a war unlike any it had faced before. No one in that room could yet see the full cost, that in choosing this path, Hitler had set Germany on a road from which there was no turning back. The strategy was as ambitious as it was ruthless. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, had shattered Poland, France, and the Low Countries in a matter of weeks. Now, in the East, it would be unleashed on a scale the world had never seen. At its heart, Blitzkrieg was not just speed, but the precise coordination of 3 elements: fast-moving armor, relentless air support, and mobile infantry to exploit every breach. In the Soviet Union, this meant driving deep into enemy territory before they could organize a coherent defense, surrounding whole armies in vast Kesselschlachten, cauldron battles, and annihilating them. The Eastern adaptation required scale. The Wehrmacht massed over 3,500 tanks, the workhorse Panzer III and Panzer IV, lighter Panzer IIs for reconnaissance, and specialized assault guns for infantry support. Above them, the Luftwaffe prepared more than 2,000 aircraft, Stuka dive bombers to shatter morale, Messerschmitt Bf-109s to clear the skies, and long-range bombers to cripple Soviet supply hubs. Radio communications, still rare in many Soviet units, gave German commanders a critical edge. Orders could be changed on the move, thrusts redirected, breakthroughs exploited within minutes. Against an army that relied heavily on rigid top-down command, this flexibility was devastating. But the Eastern Front posed challenges Blitzkrieg had never faced. The distances were staggering, hundreds of miles between objectives. Supply lines stretched across primitive roads that turned to mud in rain. Fuel, ammunition, and spare parts had to travel behind the spearheads on horse-drawn wagons as often as motorized trucks. For now, the Wehrmacht's belief in its own invincibility overshadowed these concerns. Every map showed the same bold red arrows driving toward victory. Every general expected the Soviet Union to fall before autumn's first frost. It was a plan built for speed, and one that would collapse if the enemy refused to die quickly. For months before the first German shell crossed the frontier, warning after warning had reached Moscow. Soviet spies in Berlin, Tokyo, and even London reported troop buildups, railway convoys heading east, Luftwaffe units shifting to Polish airfields. Richard Sorge, the famed Soviet agent in Tokyo, sent detailed reports naming June as the likely month of attack. But in the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin refused to believe it. His distrust of intelligence was deep, sharpened by years of political paranoia and the purges that had gutted his own officer corps. Too many reports, he insisted, were British attempts to drag the USSR into war with Germany. Even when German reconnaissance planes violated Soviet airspace repeatedly, Stalin ordered that they not be fired upon, fearing provocations that might give Hitler a pretext for attack. German deception played into this. Under the guise of preparing for an invasion of Britain, Wehrmacht units in the West conducted elaborate drills, while propaganda hinted at continued friendship with Moscow. Diplomatic exchanges between Berlin and Moscow were maintained until the last week, masking the true intent. When Soviet border commanders sent urgent messages about German armor massing just across the river, the responses from Moscow were chillingly consistent. Do not respond to provocations. Ammunition stockpiles remained locked. Aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip in neat rows, perfect targets for the Luftwaffe's opening strike. This was the blind spot that made Barbarossa's opening blow so devastating. In the critical first days, Soviet forces were not merely outmaneuvered. They were caught in a paralysis imposed from the very top. Yet as the first week of battle tore the Western Soviet Union apart, the shock began to fade. A brutal reality was dawning in Moscow. The Germans were not just raiding, they were coming to destroy everything. In the last week of June 1941, the road to Minsk became a funnel of terror. Refugees clogged the highways, farmers with carts piled high, mothers clutching children, soldiers limping eastward without weapons. Overhead, the distant hum of engines meant death. Luftwaffe bombers swooping low, strafing columns without mercy. Minsk, the capital of Soviet Belarus, was a vital junction of roads and railways. For the Germans, it was a prize to be seized quickly, cutting off vast Soviet forces in the west. For its citizens, it was still a place of fragile normalcy in the first days after the invasion. Shops opened, trams clattered through the streets, but fear had already seeped into every conversation. That fear turned to chaos on June 27th. The 2nd and 3rd Panzer Groups, having smashed through the frontier, closed in from north and south. German armored spearheads bypassed strong points, leaving them to be mopped up by following infantry. Soviet defenders, overwhelmed and without coherent orders, fought scattered, desperate battles on the city's outskirts. By the evening of June 28th, Minsk was encircled. Fires raged through the central districts, warehouses exploded as shells found fuel stores, and the black columns of smoke could be seen for miles. Tens of thousands of Red Army troops were trapped, soon to be marched westward into captivity. For the civilians who remained, the occupation began with the crack of boots on cobblestones, German voices barking orders, and the sudden reality of life under an army that had come not as conquerors of territory, but as executioners of a people. Minsk had fallen in just 6 days, but the German advance was only beginning, and ahead lay even greater cities, and even greater slaughter. The invasion was not a single thrust, but 3 massive coordinated drives, each with its own objectives, each racing across hundreds of miles of Soviet territory. On the map spread across the tables in Berlin and at the front, they were represented by thick red arrows, slashing eastward like the claws of some great predator. Army Group North, under Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb, surged from East Prussia toward Leningrad. Its mission, seize the Soviet Baltic ports, cut off the Red Fleet, and join with Finnish forces to encircle the city of Peter the Great. The terrain was forests, lakes, and marshes. Poor country for tanks, but vital for control of the north. Army Group Center, led by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, was the hammer blow. Its twin panzer groups aimed to smash through Belarus, capture Smolensk, and then drive straight to Moscow. It was the largest and most powerful of the 3, expected to deal the decisive blow that would topple the Soviet state. Army Group South, commanded by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, advanced from occupied Poland and Romania into Ukraine. Its objectives were as much economic as strategic: the grain-rich fields of Ukraine, the industrial Donbass, and eventually the oil of the Caucasus. In the opening weeks, all 3 prongs advanced with breathtaking speed. Soviet units collapsed under encirclement, prisoners were taken in the tens of thousands, and swaths of territory were overrun before Moscow could react. But the map's clean arrows concealed the reality. The distances were enormous, the roads crude, and the weather, so perfect in June, could turn against them without warning. For now, the spearheads were sharp and moving fast. Yet in the spaces between those arrows lay a vast land that had broken invaders before, and would again. In Berlin, the news from the east poured in like champagne. Radio bulletins trumpeted daily victories. Hundreds of Soviet planes destroyed on the ground, vast numbers of prisoners taken, cities falling in rapid succession. The tone was triumphant, the message clear. The Wehrmacht was unstoppable, just as it had been in France. Newspapers printed maps with the German front line leaping eastward every morning, arrows driving ever deeper into the Soviet heartland. The Ministry of Propaganda under Joseph Goebbels crafted the narrative carefully. This was not merely a military campaign. It was a righteous crusade against Bolshevik barbarism. Newsreels showed panzer crews waving from hatchtops, infantry marching in neat columns, and villages liberated from Soviet rule. Ominously, anti-Semitic rhetoric intensified, laying the groundwork for atrocities soon to follow in the occupied territories. On the German home front, morale soared. Rationing and war weariness were still manageable burdens, and the public's trust in Hitler, bolstered by his string of victories, reached its peak. Many believed the campaign would end by Christmas. In the Soviet Union, the propaganda machine struggled in the first weeks. The scale of the disaster was too great to hide. Cities lost, armies encircled. State radio appealed for unity and sacrifice, invoking the Great Patriotic War and the defense of the motherland. Heroic tales, some true and many embellished, began to emerge. Lone gunners holding bridges, tank crews fighting to the last shell, villages resisting with axes and pitchforks. Slowly, the tone shifted from shock to defiance. The war was no longer a distant threat. It was at the gates of homes and families, and for millions of Soviets, survival itself became an act of resistance. But the illusion of an invincible Wehrmacht, so carefully painted in the summer, would be tested as the front pushed deeper into a land that swallowed armies whole. In the opening weeks of Barbarossa, the Wehrmacht's advance was breathtaking, but so too was the strain on its lifelines. For every panzer racing east, there were dozens of trucks, horse-drawn carts, and fuel tankers struggling to keep up. The campaign plan assumed that supply lines could stretch hundreds of miles over Soviet roads that, in reality, were little more than dusty summer tracks or deep, rutted mud after rain. Fuel was the most pressing need. A single panzer division consumed thousands of gallons daily, and the distances in the east dwarfed anything the Germans had faced in France or the Low Countries. Capturing Soviet fuel depots eased the burden temporarily, but supply convoys were slow, vulnerable, and in constant need of maintenance. Food presented another challenge. The Wehrmacht carried rations for only a few weeks, expecting to live off the land. This often meant seizing grain, livestock, and produce from villages along the route, devastating local populations. In the south, fertile Ukrainian farmlands promised abundance. In the north and center, supplies were meager, forcing brutal requisitioning that deepened civilian hostility. A further complication was the railway gauge. Soviet tracks were wider than those in Germany, meaning trains could not simply roll east. Crews had to tear up and relay tracks as the advance continued, a process that slowed the delivery of ammunition, fuel, and spare parts. Despite these growing frictions, the first months brought such swift victories that the High Command dismissed logistical concerns. Berlin assumed the war would be decided long before supply shortages became fatal. Yet as the panzers pushed toward Smolensk, Kiev, and beyond, every extra mile of road, every bridge, every captured depot became a link in a chain that could snap without warning. And when the autumn rains came, that chain would be tested to breaking. In the first month of Barbarossa, German and Soviet medical units faced a torrent of casualties neither side had fully prepared for. Along the dusty roads behind the front, field hospitals sprang up in commandeered schools, barns, and village halls. The air inside was thick with the mingled stench of blood, disinfectant, and sweat. For the Wehrmacht, the speed of the advance was both a blessing and a curse. Wounded soldiers could be evacuated west quickly in the opening days, but as the front surged forward, distances grew. Ambulances often became mired in primitive roads or overtaken by new battle lines before reaching aid stations. Medics performed amputations on kitchen tables, using boiled water to sterilize their instruments. Morphine and bandages ran short within weeks. Soviet medical services, hit far harder, were plunged into chaos. Many hospitals near the border were destroyed in the initial Luftwaffe raids. Others were overrun with patients before the first day ended. Nurses worked for days without rest, rationing even the most basic supplies, sometimes resorting to stripping gauze from the dead to bind the living. Trains packed with wounded were bombed on sidings, turning rescue efforts into mass graves. The trauma was not only physical. Soldiers arrived with burns from tank fires, with faces shattered by shrapnel or blinded by smoke and blast. In whispered conversations, some medics spoke of Kriegsmüdigkeit, war fatigue, creeping in after only weeks, a silent injury no surgeon could treat. On both sides, there was no illusion of mercy. Captured medics were often pressed into treating enemy wounded under guard. Others simply vanished when front lines shifted. And as the summer wore on, the wounded multiplied faster than either army could heal them, a grim foreshadowing of the bloodletting still to come. Though Barbarossa was often portrayed as a Pyrrhus, a German crusade, it was, in fact, a coalition war. Several Axis partners, each with their own ambitions and grudges, joined Hitler's drive into the Soviet Union, allies in name, but often pursuing parallel wars. To the north, Finland re-entered the conflict it had been forced to abandon in the Winter War of 1939-40. Bitter over its territorial losses to the USSR, Helsinki saw Germany's attack as a chance to regain Karelia and perhaps more. Officially, Finland called it the Continuation War. Its army advanced alongside German forces toward Leningrad, threatening the city from the north. In the south, Romania committed heavily to the campaign. King Michael and Marshal Ion Antonescu sought to reclaim Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, territories seized by the Soviets in 1940. Romanian troops fought under German command along the southern front, pushing toward Odessa and the Black Sea coast. Other nations contributed in smaller ways. Hungary sent troops after initial hesitation, hoping to maintain favor with Berlin. Italy dispatched an expeditionary corps, though its forces would not play a decisive role in the first phase. Slovakia and Croatia sent smaller contingents, more for political alignment than military impact. Diplomatically, the campaign reshaped Europe's alliances. Neutral states like Spain expressed sympathy, with Franco's government allowing volunteer units to join the fight as the Blue Division. In Asia, Japan, already a German ally, chose not to open a second front against the USSR, focusing instead on its war in China and future plans in the Pacific. This patchwork coalition expanded the manpower and reach of the invasion, but it also brought complications. Divergent goals, differing levels of training and equipment, and varying commitment to Hitler's ideological war meant the Axis unity was never seamless. Still, in the summer of 1941, the combined weight of these armies gave the impression of a vast, unstoppable force, an illusion that would crumble as the campaign dragged into the brutal Russian winter. By mid-July 1941, Army Group Center had surged deep into Soviet territory. Minsk had fallen, and the road to Moscow seemed open. The next major objective was Smolensk, a city on the Dnieper River whose capture would pave the way to the Soviet capital. German commanders expected another swift encirclement, a repeat of their earlier victories. The attack began with textbook precision. Panzer Groups 2 and 3, commanded by Heinz Guderian and Hermann Hoth, drove north and south of the city, forming a tightening noose around 3 Soviet armies. Within days, thousands of Red Army troops were trapped. Berlin hailed another triumph. But this time, the trap did not close cleanly. Soviet forces fought with a desperation that slowed the German timetable. Breakout attempts were fierce. Counterattacks, though costly, forced the panzers to divert precious fuel and ammunition. The Red Army even managed to keep open a narrow corridor for days, allowing tens of thousands to escape. The battle for Smolensk lasted over 2 weeks, far longer than planned. Though the Germans eventually took the city in late July, the delay was costly. The advance toward Moscow had been stalled in the heat of summer, with autumn only weeks away. More troubling for German planners was a new realization. The Soviet Union was not collapsing. Fresh divisions were appearing, seemingly conjured from nowhere, filling the gaps the Germans thought they had torn open for good. The victory at Smolensk looked decisive on the map, but it marked the first time the Wehrmacht's momentum had been blunted. And in Hitler's war of speed, every lost day carried a shadow. The Russian winter was drawing closer, the village had. No name on German maps, just a cluster of wooden houses along a dirt road, surrounded by fields of ripening grain. It was here, in the sweltering August heat, that a Soviet partisan unit struck for the first time. At dawn, a German supply convoy rolled through, trucks heavy with fuel and ammunition for the front. From the tree line, hidden behind thick undergrowth, the partisans watched and waited. The signal came, a single bird call. Moments later, the road erupted in fire. A mine detonated beneath the lead truck, flipping it onto its side. Machine gun bursts tore into the column as panicked horses screamed and bolted. The firefight was brief but brutal. Within minutes, the partisans melted back into the forest, leaving burning vehicles behind. The retreating Germans returned within hours, and with them came retribution. Soldiers rounded up every villager they could find, accusing them of aiding the attack. By nightfall, the houses were ablaze. The glow could be seen for miles, a pillar of fire against the darkening sky. Those who survived fled into the woods, many joining the partisans out of grief and rage. The Germans saw it as a warning to others, but in villages like this, the flames lit something else, the spark of a war without front lines, one that would bleed the occupiers for years. By late summer 1941, the Red Army's early paralysis was giving way to something far more dangerous for the Germans: adaptation. Among the most potent tools revived was maskirovka, the Soviet art of military deception. Rooted in both Tsarist tradition and modern camouflage doctrine, maskirovka combined concealment, misinformation, and misdirection to confuse the enemy. On the Eastern Front, it became a lifeline. Soviet engineers built fake airfields with wooden aircraft to draw Luftwaffe bombs away from real bases. Dummy artillery positions, complete with smoke generators to mimic gunfire, lured German counter-battery fire into empty fields. Radio deception was equally effective. Soviet signals units transmitted misleading orders, sometimes mimicking captured German frequencies to sow confusion. Entire divisions were shifted under cover of night, hidden in forests and villages, emerging suddenly where the Germans least expected them. The first large-scale success came before the counterattack at Yelnya in August. Masked troop movements and false defensive works convinced the Germans that Soviet forces were thin, when in fact a concentrated strike force lay just beyond the tree line. When the attack came, it forced the Wehrmacht to yield ground for the first time in the war. These tactics did not erase the massive German advantage in mobility and firepower, but they chipped away at the perception of German omniscience. Where in June the Wehrmacht had seemed to know every Soviet weakness, by September they were beginning to run into ghosts, divisions that appeared from nowhere, guns that seemed to fire from thin air. For the Soviets, maskirovka was more than deception. It was survival through cunning, a way to fight when strength alone was not enough. In the first weeks of Barbarossa, German tank crews had faced mostly outdated Soviet models, thinly armored BT series, and T-26s that the Panzer III and IV could destroy at range. But by August, reports from the front began filtering back to Berlin about something different, tanks the Germans could not easily kill. The first was the T-34, a revolutionary design with sloped armor that deflected shells, a powerful 76.2mm gun, and wide tracks that allowed it to glide over mud that bogged down German vehicles. It was fast, rugged, and could be produced in large numbers. In the chaos of early battles, small groups of T-34s sometimes smashed through German spearheads, absorbing hits that would have destroyed lesser machines. Then there was the KV-1, a heavy tank that was virtually impervious to all but the largest German guns. At Raseiniai in Lithuania, a single KV-1 held off an entire German division for hours, knocking out dozens of vehicles before being brought down with concentrated artillery and point-blank fire. For Wehrmacht crews, these encounters were sobering. The standard 37mm door-knocker anti-tank gun was useless against them, and even the Panzer IV's short-barreled 75mm struggled unless it could hit from the flank or rear. New weapons, like the 50mm Pak-38, were rushed forward, but there were never enough. The appearance of the T-34 and KV-1 shattered the illusion that German armor was unmatched. Soviet factories, many still vulnerable in the West, were already being dismantled and moved east beyond the Urals, where production would only grow. For now, the numbers were still on Germany's side, but these machines were harbingers of a future battlefield where the Soviets would meet and surpass the Wehrmacht's steel on its own terms. By early September 1941, the noose around Leningrad was tightening. Army Group North had swept through the Baltic states, linked up with Finnish forces on the Karelian Isthmus, and severed the last rail lines feeding the city from the south. On September 8th, the Germans captured Schlisselburg at the head of Lake Ladoga, and the encirclement was complete. Leningrad, a city of nearly 3 million people, was now cut off from the rest of the Soviet Union. The Germans expected it to fall quickly, starved into submission. Hitler ordered that the city not be stormed, but erased from the earth, its population left to perish. The Finns, though stopping short of direct assault, held their positions to the north, sealing the trap. Inside the city, panic gave way to grim determination. Food stocks were desperately low. By autumn, bread rations fell to a few ounces per day. Families boiled leather belts for soup. Children collapsed in the streets from hunger, their bodies carted away on sleds. Bombardments became routine, shattering water mains and setting neighborhoods ablaze. Yet the city refused to surrender. Factories continued to turn out weapons, sometimes with workers collapsing at their stations from malnutrition. Cultural life persisted in defiance. Orchestras played, writers chronicled the siege, and radio broadcasts urged endurance. Ozo. Leningrad's agony was only beginning. The siege would last 872 days, but its survival against every expectation would become one of the defining symbols of Soviet resistance. For the Germans, however, the frozen stalemate at Leningrad foreshadowed a bitter truth. The Eastern Front would not yield the quick, clean victory they had imagined. On the maps in Hitler's headquarters, the drive to Moscow looked straightforward. A final thrust east from Smolensk along the Minsk-Moscow highway, the same route Napoleon had taken in 1812. In reality, the road was a thin ribbon of asphalt, surrounded by endless dirt tracks, forests, and rivers that could become major obstacles with a single rainstorm. By late September 1941, the German advance had slowed to a crawl. Soviet defenses were stiffening, fed by fresh reserves drawn from the vast interior. Every mile forward meant longer supply lines, more fuel burned, more vehicles breaking down. Bridges had to be rebuilt under fire, and captured railways had to be converted from the Soviet wide gauge before they could be used. Operation Typhoon, the offensive to take Moscow, began in early October. The Wehrmacht sought to encircle the Soviet capital in two massive pincer movements. At first, it seemed to work. Vyazma and Bryansk fell, trapping hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops. But those pockets took precious weeks to reduce, and the delay proved fatal to the timetable. The weather turned. First came the autumn rains, the dreaded Rasputitsa, turning roads into rivers of mud. Supply convoys bogged down. Tanks sank to their hulls. Exhausted soldiers waded through knee-deep sludge. By the time the ground began to freeze in November, the temperature plummeted, and German troops still wore light summer uniforms. Moscow lay just over the horizon, its spires and smokestacks almost within reach. But between the Wehrmacht and the capital now stretched not only miles of hostile terrain, but the gathering force of winter, and a Soviet army that had learned to survive the storm. The first snow fell in late October, light at first, then thicker, driven by sharp winds. Within weeks, the Eastern Front froze solid. For the Wehrmacht, still in summer uniforms and short on winter gear, the cold became an enemy as deadly as the Red Army. Frostbite cases surged. Fingers, toes, ears turned black in the biting air. Medics amputated limbs in unheated tents, their instruments freezing to their hands. Lubricants in rifles and machine guns congealed, forcing soldiers to urinate on bolts to free them. Vehicles that had survived the mud now refused to start, their engines locked solid in sub-zero temperatures. For the wounded, winter was merciless. Blood loss that might have been survivable in summer became fatal in minutes. Soldiers carried the injured wrapped in blankets, their breath turning to ice on their faces. Field hospitals burned whatever fuel they could find, wood from wrecked houses, even furniture, just to keep operating rooms above freezing. Soviet troops, though also suffering, were better prepared. Winter uniforms, felt boots, and experience in extreme cold gave them an edge. Civilians brought hot food to frontline positions, dug warm shelters, and taught soldiers how to insulate boots with straw. Psychologically, the cold gnawed at the Germans. Men spoke of Russian winter as if it were a living force, invisible, relentless, striking without warning. It dulled reflexes, slowed thought, and made every step a labor. And through it all, the fighting continued. The winter did not stop the war. It only made every wound, every march, and every decision more painful. By November 1941, the German army stood at the very gates of Moscow. Some forward units could see the city's outer suburbs through their field glasses. Panic spread briefly in the Soviet capital. Ministries burned sensitive documents, and foreign embassies evacuated. Many in the Wehrmacht believed one final push could end the war in the East. But in the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin made a decision that would define the Soviet war effort. Against the advice of some commanders, he refused to abandon the city or even leave it. His presence in Moscow became a rallying symbol, and his speeches, broadcast across the Soviet Union, framed the fight as a historic battle for the survival of the motherland. "Not one step back," he ordered. Reserves from Siberia, hardened by Arctic winters and freed by intelligence that Japan would not attack from the east, began arriving in force. In East Prussia, Hitler faced his own choice. His generals urged him to allow defensive withdrawals in overstretched sectors to consolidate for the push on Moscow. Hitler refused. Retreat was unthinkable. He ordered all positions held to the last man, regardless of cost. The belief that sheer will could overcome logistical collapse blinded him to the realities his troops faced. By early December, the Soviet counteroffensive began. German units, exhausted and frozen, were driven back from the city in the first major strategic defeat of the war. Yet Hitler refused to acknowledge the scale of the setback, insisting the front could be stabilized without major withdrawals. Two leaders, two very different calculations, but each willing to gamble the lives of millions to hold their chosen ground. For Stalin, it preserved Moscow. For Hitler, it marked the point where ambition hardened into a war Germany could no longer win. By December 1941, the Wehrmacht's supply system was collapsing under the weight of distance, weather, and attrition. The vast lifelines that had fed the summer advance were now brittle threads stretching hundreds of miles back to Poland and East Prussia. Every link in the chain was under strain. Fuel was the most critical shortage. The cold thickened petrol to sludge, and drums froze solid if left outside too long. Deliveries often arrived days late, or not at all, leaving tanks and trucks abandoned by the roadside. Ammunition convoys, already slowed by snow-choked tracks, faced the constant threat of partisan raids, which could destroy days' worth of supplies in minutes. Railways, converted from Soviet broad gauge at great cost, were barely able to function in the freezing conditions. Locomotives broke down from overuse, and spare parts were almost impossible to get forward. Horses, which still hauled much of the army's transport, died in droves, their bodies stiffening in harnesses along the frozen roads. German troops tried to improvise, burning captured Soviet fuel that often damaged engines, salvaging boots and coats from the dead, eating what they could seize from villages. But the countryside was already stripped bare, and starvation crept into the ranks. The Soviets, meanwhile, drew strength from shorter interior supply lines feeding the Moscow front. Fresh divisions arrived with winter uniforms, food, and ammunition, ferried by rail lines the Germans had failed to cut. The contrast was stark, one side shivering and hungry, the other slowly building momentum. By January, it was clear. The Wehrmacht could not sustain its offensive in the east. The frozen lifelines had not just slowed the German war machine, they had begun to strangle it. When the first winter of Barbarossa ended, the dream of a quick victory over the Soviet Union lay in ruins. German forces had been driven back from the gates of Moscow, their casualties numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Frostbite, disease, and starvation had claimed nearly as many as bullets and shells. The Soviet losses were staggering. Millions of soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. Vast swaths of territory occupied. Cities burned to the ground. Yet, the Red Army had survived. It had not collapsed as Hitler had predicted. Instead, it was growing stronger, learning from its defeats and preparing for the long war ahead. The cost to civilians was beyond calculation. Entire villages vanished, their populations executed or deported. In the occupied territories, the German campaign became a war of annihilation. Jews, political commissars, and countless others were murdered under the cover of the frontline advance. For survivors, memories of 1941 were seared in images of burning homes, mass graves, and endless columns of prisoners shuffling into captivity. In Germany, the propaganda of a swift, glorious campaign gave way to a grimmer reality. Letters home spoke of frozen comrades and battles that never seemed to end. Families who had expected their sons back by Christmas were now told the war in the East would continue into the next year, and perhaps beyond. In hindsight, Barbarossa was not only the largest invasion in history, it was also the moment Hitler's fate, and Germany's, was sealed. The gamble had failed, and the price would be paid, in blood and ruin, for the rest of the war. Operation Barbarossa began as Hitler's boldest stroke, and ended as the turning point that doomed the Third Reich. In 6 months, the war in the East transformed from a lightning offensive into a grinding struggle of survival. The Wehrmacht's aura of invincibility shattered in the snows before Moscow, replaced by the grim reality of a two-front war it could never truly win. For the Soviet Union, the price of survival was almost unimaginable. Millions dead, millions more displaced, entire cities reduced to ash. Yet the state endured. The winter of 1941 was not a final victory, but it proved that the Red Army could hold, adapt, and strike back. The tide of the war would not turn overnight, but the momentum was shifting, slowly, inexorably, against Germany. The legacy of Barbarossa reaches beyond its military history. It was a collision of ideologies, fascism seeking to erase communism, and communism determined to survive at any cost. It unleashed atrocities on a scale the world had rarely seen, setting the stage for the Holocaust's expansion and the total war that consumed Eastern Europe. Even today, its shadow lingers. In Russia, it remains the opening chapter of the Great Patriotic War, a story of endurance against impossible odds. In Germany, it stands as the fatal overreach that ensured defeat. In the early hours of June 22, 1941, the guns roared with the promise of swift conquest. By the year's end, they echoed with the truth. In reaching for everything, Hitler had lost the war. On the frozen road to Moscow, the Empire of the Thousand Years began its march into the grave.